It is a cold day here in February, and we are putting a motor in a 2011 Juke. This has the dig motor. Timing chain ended up going bad on the old motor, and the tensioner had broken in half. I think I still have it here actually somewhere. That's a piece of it. Those are oil control solenoids. Those have, if you can see on there, all the metal shavings. That chain was rubbing on the inside timing cover and was spitting metal shavings everywhere. The motor picked it up. I had brass shavings, I had steel shavings, I had aluminum shavings. Yeah, that motor was done. It wasn't knocking, just the chain was growling and bitching real bad, and I didn't feel good about putting the timing chain in it and then having the motor seized in a couple thousand miles. So we went ahead and sold him a used motor. Let's see, where do you even start with this one? A 4-point hoist is almost mandatory. I'm sure you could possibly take the entire front end off. Cooling fan, radiator, intercooler, AC condenser, the header bar right there, and then the front bumper, headlights, fenders, hood, and you might be able to hoist it out the front. I don't know, I've never tried it that way. If you have a 4-point hoist, this is really the way to do it. All data quoted something like 20 hours to do this. Biggest things you got to remember is that's your evap hose right there, that little black tube. You've got heater hoses that need to come off. That's a shift linkage off the trans. You have to drop the trans with it. There's not enough room to wiggle either one out. It has to be brought down as an assembly. And then you've got AC compressor. I ended up sucking it down. I didn't see any room really to move it out of the way, so I ended up sucking the AC down and moving the compressor. Drive line's got to be unbolted. It's just 4 bolts. Exhaust has got to be unbolted. And then you've got, this is the subframe I've already got pulled out. 4 bolts. And then you got to pull the ball joints. Those can be a pain, tie rods, end links. And then go inside the vehicle and disconnect your steering column shaft. Just make sure the steering wheel stays straight. You don't want a spiral cable spinning on you and breaking. All in all, not a fun process really. There's a lot that has to get moved, and then be very careful bringing it down. You can see this is the lower radiator hose here. Has a bracket on it that bolts up to the fan. You can see that I actually broke it because I didn't bother to unbolt it. It actually ended up catching and breaking. Be careful of that. Go real slow when you're pulling this motor out. There's just a lot of sensors that are very expensive that you can break. Here's the motor and trans assembly. Now I've got the new motor on here with the trans already bolted up to it, and everything's already swapped over. This is the turbo. Now this is the 2011, so the turbo is actually not part of the manifold. It can be unbolted. Just for time and ease of access, I just ended up pulling the manifold itself, and then leaving the turbo still bolted onto it. This is really just a cluster as far as everything that needs to come off and get swapped over. Just take your time, take pictures if you need to, pay attention really to what you're doing and where everything needs to go. You don't want to mix up and hook up a vacuum line or to a coolant line, or an oil line to a coolant line. That would just make a mess real quick. So take your time, be careful with it. The only way to separate the engine and the trans, or to get to the converter bolts, is to pull your starter. I found it was a lot easier to have the intake manifold pulled. It's only 5 bolts, but you have a ton of vacuum lines and coolant lines in the way. If you don't have a 4-point hoist, I'm sure it could be done, and someday I might end up having to do it, but yeah, not fun. The heat shields are really not any fun, because it's better to have the exhaust nice and hot before you take any of the heat shield bolts off, because these little bastards love to snap. Oh, they love to snap. And that's only part of them. You've got one heat shield that sits here, that guy. And Then you have this one sits here, and then there's one that wraps around the manifold down here. And then there is the upper one that sits up top here underneath this one. I mean, it's an absolute cluster. And then you have your downpipe with the cat that wraps back down around to the rest of the exhaust. I don't know that you necessarily have to pull this for ease of access. It's a lot easier just to go ahead and pull the transfer case out. I went ahead and left the CV axles in this time. Probably should have pulled them, but I haven't damaged the boots or anything, so I'm not too worried about that. Yeah, a lot to it. Take your time and pay attention to what you're doing. I'll post another video here when we're going back in. We're just about to that step. Still got to get the exhaust back on it. And really, this is basically about how it comes out. Is almost complete. Because there's really not a lot of room in there to work. I mean, even with these pulled out, these are still just a cluster with the amount of tubing. I mean, yeah, they're a joke. You got your intake. This is your throttle body down here. And then you got your supply running down. This actually runs down to the intercooler, and then the intercooler hooks back up and comes from here, from the turbo, and back down. And then your intake from your air filter and mass sensors right here. Yeah, I hope this helps some of you guys out. I'll be throwing up another video here when I go in with this.